Did anyone else notice during the first few months of the lockdown that everybody was either hoarding yeast or making sourdough? That was weird, right? Who needs that much bread anyway?
I just said, yes, man, right away, anything.
So I actually started making sourdough last year, but I didn't actually get good at it until things started shutting down and then everybody and their mother was making sourdough bread. So I'm not as cool as I like to think I am. If you're not sure why everybody is so crazy about sourdough, it's because it's delicious. Trust me, if you've never had it, you need to try it. It has a ton more flavor and texture than regular bread made with commercial yeast because it's actually a colony of wild yeast and bacteria that anyone can actually grow, you included. Kind of comes in handy when a global pandemic turns ordinary people into yeast hoarding dumbasses. Got to make bread somehow because there wasn't any in the store, was there? If you're still not sure what I'm talking about, here's a quick little primer on sourdough. The first thing you need is a starter culture to make the bread. It takes a week to make, so you might want to plan ahead. All you do is get equal parts flour and water. I go with 100 grams of each. Mix them in a jar and let them sit for 24 hours. The next day, you dump out most of that gloopy mess, keeping at least a tablespoon in the jar to mix with a fresh dose of equal parts of flour and water again. Keep doing this exact process for at least 7 days until it starts to double in volume throughout the day from all the CO2 gas being released as the yeast colony feeds on the flour. It's like a pet. You've got to feed it every day to take care of it. It's your sourdough puppy, a stinky pet rock. Fair warning, it's going to smell like crap for the first 4 or 5 days. But by day 6 and 7, it'll start smelling beery, yeasty, and bready, like a fresh rising dough, because technically that's exactly what it is. Congratulations! You just made a starter. It's actually quite an accomplishment. These things are awesome. Everything in here is alive. And it's different from anyone else's. Someone in your family could make another one. If they made it from a different bag of flour in a different house, it's gonna be a different starter. Because what you did is you cultivated a tiny little bit of wild yeast and bacteria floating around in the flour and in the air into a robust colony of yeast that is now so full of life and activity that you can use it to make bread. That's awesome. But it's yeast, right? Can't we use it to brew? Well, of course you can. But you've got to keep in mind that yeast isn't the only thing that's growing in here. There's a lot of bacteria in here too. There's potentially lactobacillus, acetobacter. It could be a number of things. A lot of that just lives naturally on the grain. It could be on the equipment where the grain was milled. It could be on the inside of the bag when they bagged it. There's a million places it could come from. But if it smells like beer, it smells like bread, it's nice and yeasty, and it's got that kind of sour tang to it, it's got bacteria in it. What that means is if you take this and you mix it into a beer wort, you're gonna get a sour beer. It's just a guarantee because of the bacteria that's in there. Now, normally, if you're brewing an intentionally sour beer, you put in commercial yeast and commercially isolated strains of bacteria, you have a pretty clear idea of what's gonna come out the other end after it's done fermenting. But you can't do that with this. Sourdough, by its very nature, is completely and totally unpredictable because it's wild yeast and wild bacteria. Unless you send this off to a lab, there's really no way to know for sure what you have growing in this jar. So the sourdough is not so great for beer brewing, but my theory is that it's fantastic for whiskey and rum. And that's because of the bacteria. And the bacteria are going to produce some really funky flavors by making esters. But if you know anything about whiskey and rum, you know that esters are what we're looking for. They create the flavor profiles that are characteristic to what we're going after. And then sometimes you'll get some esters that are completely uncharacteristic, but they work. It's part of the alchemy of this hobby that I really, I get excited about it, probably a little too excited about it. Not that way. Case in point, this jar right here that I started about 18 days ago, bananas. Straight, rotten bananas. That's exactly what's going on in here. It's weird, and I love it. Interesting side note, there's also a pretty good hit of acetone being produced in here. I thought it was really interesting, so I told my wife, hey, come here and smell this. And, you know, thinking she's gonna go, bananas. She took a sniff of it and she was like, whoa, nail polish remover, what are you doing? There's a little bit of nail polish remover, but also lots and lots of banana. According to Google, the reason why I'm getting acetone in this is because it's warmer in the house, it's summertime, and the yeast are popping. They are just going crazy. So they're eating through their food a lot faster. They get a little stressed out. The bacteria will start to get stressed out too, and they will produce a lot of acid, and that acid can then break down into acetone. According to Google, if I feed this twice a day, it will kind of reinvigorate it and it'll start smelling normal. But honestly, I'm glad I didn't know that until a few days ago, because now I have this crazy banana ester bomb to throw into a whiskey wash. Now, you can use a sourdough on whatever you want. Whatever recipe you're gonna do for your whiskey, for your rum, for your brandy, whatever. Because ultimately, the funk that's growing in this jar is gonna have a very significant impact on the flavor of whatever we end up making. And that's what we're after. That's what we're testing today. What does this do? Now, Jesse just recently did a whiskey with a Kveik yeast, and he got some really weird stuff that you would not expect. Papaya, pineapple, stuff like that. I'll put a link for his video right up there if you want to check it out. And what's interesting about his is that those flavors, those esters, actually made it all the way through the still and came out in the whiskey. So I have no idea if the banana is actually gonna make it all the way through or if it's gonna transform into something else. But honestly, I can't wait to find out. So here's the other thing that's kind of cool. The whiskey that we make with this jar is gonna be the only whiskey of that type in the entire world. If I keep feeding this for a month, let's say I make this whiskey today, but in a month I want to make some more. I still have my starter. I've been feeding it every day so that it stays alive and healthy. But every time I feed it, I'm changing it just a little. The bacteria will change, the yeast will change, the numbers will change, the chemicals that they're producing, the aromas, the esters, those are all going to change slightly up and down over time. So the whiskey you make today will be different than the whiskey you make tomorrow when you're using wild yeast. Keep that in mind, because if you do this, you're gonna make a one-of-a-kind whiskey. That's kind of cool, but it's also kind of sad. Sad little tear. All right, I am basically out of all of my brewing supplies. Like, I'm scraping the bottom of old kits and I have little bits of stuff left over. This is gonna be a Frankenstein whiskey. I'm using up all the little leftover bits of grains and sugars because we're still broke from building this house, and I have not been able to get anything. But I really wanted to do this project. I've been excited about it for months, and I just finally am able to do it. So without further ado, here's my ingredient list, and know this, I make no apologies for what you're about to see. I have about 6 ounces of corn sugar. I have a pound of 2-row barley. I have a pound of mixed grain for an Irish red ale kit. I have a pound of caramel malt and about a half a pound of mixed grain from a brown ale kit. I have 6 pounds of light malt extract, a pound of light dry malt extract, about 12 ounces of honey, about 2 ounces of molasses. So if you want to try and replicate this recipe, I guess you can, but there's not really any point, because even if you got the exact amounts of ingredients that I'm using, the starter that you make at your house is going to be completely different from the starter that I have here. That was a lot of talking, but let's get this monster stitched together. I'm using the glucoamylase, which is a room temperature enzyme, to convert any of the starch left in that sourdough starter. And I'm adding a couple of crushed up Beano tablets, which are alpha galactosidase, another enzyme, to help break down any of the unfermentable sugars common to the full-bodied beer styles in my grain bill. That should help it ferment all the way out to be completely dry. It's alive.
Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
All right, so it's been about 3 days from pitching this. It's going pretty good. So the starting gravity of this one was 1.078. If it ferments all the way out to dryness, down to 1.000, it'll be about 9.7% alcohol. But here's the other issue with wild yeast. I have no idea what the alcohol tolerance of this stuff is. All yeasts have a tolerance to how toxic their environment can be, and that's basically their alcohol tolerance. Commercial yeast strains are cultivated, and so they have a very stable and consistent performance. You know what their alcohol tolerance range is going to be, so you can bank on it. This stuff, not so much. Some commercial yeast can be as high as 20%. Some wild yeasts can be as low as like 3 or 4%. I have no idea what's going to happen. But I've prepared for that. In a few days, after this sourdough has had a chance to eat as much sugar as it can and produce a bunch of funky esters and flavors that I'm looking for, I'm going to take a gravity reading. If it craps out and there's still a whole bunch of sugar left in here, I have no problem with dumping in a whole bunch of commercial yeast, like some distiller's yeast or champagne yeast with a really high alcohol tolerance. Basically to go in and clean up all the rest of the sugar, because I want that alcohol. That way you get the best of both worlds. You get the unpredictability of all of the crazy flavors and activity and off flavors, and then you have the reliability of the commercial yeast making that alcohol content that you were expecting. So let the sourdough do whatever it's going to do, and then fix it if you need to. But give it time to be funky. So if you enjoyed this video and you thought it was entertaining, you learned anything, do me a favor and hit the like button, because it really helps out the channel. If you'd like to help me keep this channel going and posting videos on a more regular basis, like I've always wanted to, and help me get the equipment and supplies that I need for future videos, consider supporting me on Patreon. Links below. And if you want to follow along with whatever weird projects I'm going to get into in the future, hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit the little bell icon so that you get notified when I post new content. Full recipe is going to be down in the video description along with links for all this. Man, it sure smells good. All right. Talk at you later.
Everybody pose to the beat. Can you take a ride with me? God, I hope we didn't